horrifying true ghost stories to fall asleep to. The Walking Dead. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he didn't, wouldn't, or couldn't talk, but there's no medical reason as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life. In fact, he seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He had been raised in the deep South and joined the military when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into the VA hospital emergency room and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duncan, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered in dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His Social Security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whoever was claiming to be him simply couldn't be. They demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day, every day, moving his mouth that made it look like he was talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he was laughing heartedly, but not even a breath could be heard. If I was talking to him, he appeared to be listening, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin. Unless told to stay put, he would just get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Marion pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. The unrest stop. I was driving across country with my mom and my sister when I was 16 and my sister was 20. It was late, but we were well rested and alert. We were driving along an interstate and needed gas and a bathroom break, so we stopped at the only rest stop in 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on the road trip at that gas station, as well as a small gray car parked at the pump in front of us with 2 young men standing outside of it. When we got there, everything felt wrong. We'd been on the road for days and seen many rest stops at night and never been afraid until now. My mom and my sister went inside and I stayed in the car. I heard the teenagers say that they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work, and they left in a hurry. I was watching the car in front of us, and the 2 men had not moved at all, not an inch. They weren't talking. They weren't on their phones. They were just standing there, still as stone. My sister and mom came running back out to the car, and when they got in, the 2 men slowly turned to look at us while not moving or pivoting the rest of their body. And I swear, we saw the same thing. They had eyes dark as pitch and empty, truly empty, not black, not reflecting any light at all, just void. We sped out of there and didn't stop until we went to the next city. The worst thing about the entire trip, we couldn't find the place on a map. We knew exactly which stop on the interstate to look, and we couldn't find it on Google Maps or any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station on that stretch of the road and only got confused looks. We've traveled on that interstate since, and there was no rest stop. It came for us in the graveyard. We were driving my friend's really old beat-up Subaru through a massive graveyard. We stopped and walked down a hill and came across a little pond. There was someone sitting on a rock on the other side of the pond. The figure was all black, and we couldn't make out any features other than the fact that it looked like it was a man wearing an old-style top hat. We stupidly waved and said hi. He didn't show any acknowledgement and continued sitting there still as a rock. All of a sudden, he jumped to his feet and started running to us on the water, and then vanished in thin air about halfway over the pond. My friend and I screamed and ran back to the car. The car wouldn't start, and we heard something banging on the back of it. It wasn't a constant bang, but every few seconds or so, we would hear it. Nobody was outside from what we could see in the dark, but something was making that noise in the car. I opened my phone and started dialing my mom's number to give us a jump. But I had no service. None of us had any cell service. The next 30 minutes were spent trying to get the car started. No banging was heard afterwards, but we felt this heavy pressure around us. Finally, the car started, and my friend floored it. We sped out of the graveyard so fast, immediately crossing the gate, and all of our phones regained cell service. One thing I know for certain is that someone or something was out there, and it was not an animal or a human. It was good to see an old friend. When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of town, I saw someone on the side of the road flagging me down. It turns out it was one of the guys I had attended school with, Jim. He gets into the car, and we start talking. I had not seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same, maybe a little older. We got to town, and I asked him if he wanted to come into the VFW and have a drink. He says no, just take me home. Jim's parents had lived only a few blocks from my grandma's house, and I turned in that direction, but he said to take him to the outskirts of town. There was a mobile home park there, and I figured that that's where he lived. When we reached the end of the turnoff, he said, "Just drop me here. It was good to see you again." And he walks off into the night. I go to the VFW, met some old classmates, and we start to talk. As we were talking about who was coming to the reunion, I mentioned that I had stopped and picked up Jim about 3 miles east of town and dropped him off. Everyone got quiet. Even the guy singing karaoke stops and lays down the microphone. My cousin goes white as a t-shirt. "Barb, Jim died on that curve 8 years ago. Rolled his car. We were all there at the funeral. I told you." I started to feel really dizzy, and I went out to the car to take some deep breaths. There on the seat is the local newspaper, printed 8 years previous, containing Jim's obituary. I still have the paper. The Death March. My dad used to work as a correction officer at a rural prison. He drove the perimeter of the property for his entire shift, where he would check empty buildings for runaway inmates. It was generally a boring job. One night my dad was parked on the hill reading a magazine when he started to feel a thumping in his body. He described it as the feeling you would get when speakers are playing a song with really heavy bass. He put the magazine down and checked his rearview mirror when he saw someone outside the truck. He grabbed his pistol and jumped out of the truck with his weapon drawn. Outside the truck, he realized it was a procession of Native Americans walking through the truck and directly through his seat, only to disappear at the exact same spot he was sitting. He said it was clear they were ghosts because many of them appeared injured. This went on for a few seconds, and then the whole procession disappeared. He called the other perimeter guard on his walkie and tried to explain. The other guy immediately stopped communicating. Turns out the other guy had seen this happen before, but didn't believe in ghosts, so he didn't want to talk about it. The demon's room. I worked as a forensic nurse in a hospital's lock-up unit. We had one older lady who swore she was being haunted and abused by a demon. She would call it Tiberius. So many crazy things happened while she was on the unit. We'd go into her room, do normal care, leave, and seconds later she'd be screaming bloody murder. We'd run into the room to find her looking like she had just got into a boxing fight, with a bloody lip, black eye, and markings all over her body. No one ever saw her doing this to herself. Things would get moved around the room by themselves. At one point, she was in protective restraints because the doctors thought that she was hurting herself. There was no way she could move or do anything to herself while she was in these restraints. But new marks would always appear on her, and her tray would end up across the room. The room was secure, so there was no one in it. When we asked her questions, she'd just say it was Tiberius. After she was discharged, we always had trouble with that room. If there was going to be a rapid response or a code, it would happen in that room. One night, a guard reported lights blinking on and off. It was in that room. My uncle's house. My uncle's house out on a very eastern part of New York was said to be haunted because the family that used to own it in the 1800s decided to not give it to the stableman and sold it instead. My uncle's friend and her sister stayed over one night, and the friend noticed a maid bringing towels down the stairs. She saw the maid again bringing what looked like a percolator down the stairs. She was so impressed by my uncle hiring staff. He is a neurologist in New York, so he had a habit of spending a little bit extra money. She went back to bed and woke up later and came downstairs to see my uncle and his friend just chatting. She asked where the maid went and thought that the maid was cooking breakfast. My uncle had no idea what she was talking about and asked what she looked like. The sister explained and laughed, walked her to the living room, and pointed to an old picture. She said, "Is that the woman?" My uncle replied, "Yeah, she's been dead for about 100 years. The haunted house. I lived in a house for about 5 years that was haunted, but not in a malicious way, in a shitty roommate kind of way. I'd come home to the windows on the second floor being open when it was raining. Food containers opened in the fridge that hadn't even been touched yet. The worst was that the ghost hated clocks. She hated them. I had antique cuckoo clocks that had worked for over 50 years that would just stop. Brand new wall clocks that ate through batteries like candy. My watch ended up on the floor one morning. The crystals shattered, even though I knew I slept with it on. The one thing that pissed me off the most was that I got a brand new Kit Kat clock for Christmas, and the bitch threw it off the wall. I was cooking. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the cat freaking fly. I turned around, and it was in the kitchen, broken. It was brand new. She was a bitch. Haunted college house. I lived in an old haunted house in college. Things got so weird that everyone moved out except for me and one roommate. Here are some things that had happened. Number 1. I woke up at 3 a.m. because my roommate's door kept opening and slamming shut. From bed, I yelled at him to stop, only to realize that I was the only one home that weekend. As soon as I yelled, the slamming stopped, but the hippie beads I had hanging outside my closet door began to sway violently against the door frame for about an hour, while I debated if I should pop out my air conditioner unit and jump from the window. I laid in a fetal position in bed until it stopped. Number 2. I woke up at 3 a.m. alone again, hearing the Nintendo on the back porch playing loudly. I figured it was a drunk kid that came in and started to play. I grabbed my bat and walked towards the back of the house as the music got louder and louder. As soon as I opened the door, it was completely quiet. Mind you, it was loud enough to wake me up. Number 3. I had friends over and told them that the house was haunted. No one believed me, so I asked the ghost to do something to prove it was there. As soon as I asked, all the lights in the house began to flicker off and on for a minute straight. This was in the middle of the day and everyone witnessed it. Number 4. Almost everyone who stayed at my house had sleep paralysis at least once. Number 5. Every time something spooky happened, the house would smell like old lady, flowery kind of perfume. Number 6. This house had a door built into the floor that led to the basement. We always had a rug covering up so no one knew it was there. Things would constantly go missing in the house and turned up in the basement. This house had an old coal chute from when it was heated by coal back in the day. Missing stuff would always be placed on the chute in the basement when we came home. Number 7. Roommate had some issues. Once while playing a video game, late at night, he saw a mist kind of hovering over the kitchen and then moving into the bathroom. The bathroom had a trap door that led to the attic. That's where we figured the old lady liked to hang out. Number 8. Roommate was up late. He went to go lock the doors and turn off the lights. When he turned his back on the room and walked to the door, someone breathed into his ear. He thought it was me. I was sleeping. He turned around, pissed himself, and ran to his room. He was so afraid to come out and turn off the lights again. Number 9. Loud thumps in the attic at all hours. For peace of mind, we told ourselves that there was squirrels in the attic. Number 10. Voices that would wake us up in the middle of the night. I spent many mornings on the front porch waiting for the sun to come up before I would go back in the house. Number 11. Coincidentally, I had a friend years later that rented from the same landlord, same town, different house, where he and all his roommates moved out because the house was haunted. I didn't think it was too weird until he was telling me that when all the weird stuff started to happen, it was accompanied by old lady, flowery perfume. Also, a lot of people had sleep paralysis in that house as well.